All right, we'll go live. Well, welcome. If you're seeing this is our very first Fishers Historical Society. I don't know what we're going to call it. Fishers Chat, Fishers History Chat. I don't know. We're gonna we're gonna come up with something. But Phil Cowie is our guest tonight. I'm really excited about having him. I haven't seen Phil in a very, very, very long time. I think, and I'm going to tell you something. You probably will not remember this. The very first time I met you, you were pretending to be hanging from your staircase of your parents' place. You were dangling from the stairs. It scared the snot out of me as I walked in the door. You were probably 15 or something like that. So anyway, so that is the very first image I had of Phil Cowie in my head. I used to run around with his big brother Jack, and then in fact, his dad, Reverend Don Cowie, is who married my wife and I. So we go back a little ways.
It does go
So,
back.
so welcome, Phil. Tell us. So you were our very first Fishers paid professional firefighter. Is that a good way to put it, or?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I got hired in 1980. Let's see. Well, I got to think when it was. 87, I believe it was, and stayed there through 1996.
Okay. So what now, fire department, when I was growing up in Fishers was, all volunteer. We
Hmm.
used to have
Hmm.
the fire department always had the fish fries. They shut down 116th Street and they would operate out of that little bitty concrete block building
Oh
right there
yeah,
on 106th. Is that where you started, in that same building, or?
that is where I started. I actually was a volunteer before. I moved to Fishers back in 1978 or 79, I think it was. As soon as I graduated from high school, and oddly enough, I remember sitting in the little house that I rented. I rented a half of a double off of South Street, and I remember sitting in my living room and watching the kid across the street who was on the volunteer fire department. Every now and then, I'd see him run out to his car, and he'd put his blue light on the roof and take off to the fire station while the siren was going off. And I watched that enough times that I thought that looks cool. That looks like it might be fun. So I decided to join the fire department, and I was a volunteer there for quite a while. But then I went to work full time at Lawrence Township Fire Department down in Indianapolis, across the border on 96th Street, and I was there from 1981 until 1987 as a career firefighter for Lawrence Township, and that's when I made the change and went to Fishers. So during that time, I was kind of had a foot in both worlds. I was a volunteer with Fishers, and I was a career firefighter with Lawrence Township.
Now, did they recruit you to come on and get their fire department started, or how did that come about?
Yeah, actually, about 1987, it got to the point where it was getting pretty obvious that there was going to be a need for some career firefighters. Even back then, the volunteer fire department ran the ambulance service too, and we had kind of moved to the point where we had paramedics from Riverview Hospital that were in the building. So we had paramedics or a paramedic chase car, and then we had our own ambulance service there running out of the fire department as well. And it was so busy. It was getting so busy in 1987. As you remember, that's when all the construction and all the explosive growth was going on. Not that that's ever stopped, but I think it was really kicking in high gear about 1987. And it was felt that it was time to go to add some career people to the fire department, to the existing volunteers. And it was kind of interesting the way that worked. Back then, the volunteer fire department was a private corporation that actually contracted with the town of Fishers and with Delaware Township and with Fall Creek Township. So we were a private corporation that contracted with these entities. And when it was determined that we really needed it to look at becoming a part career, part paid fire department, it was felt that we really ought to become a municipal department, just like the police department or the street department. And so at that time in 1987, the town accepted the idea of having the fire department turned over to the town. So literally, we signed a contract and gave everything we owned to the town. It became town property. And one night in front of the town council, the entire volunteer fire department was sworn in as volunteer firefighters for the city of Fishers, for the town of Fishers. At the time it was town, for the town of Fishers. And so there was a conversion really in 87 from a private nonprofit corporation that had run the fire department since the 50s. That fire department went all the way back to the 50s. And it became a department of the town. So at the time it became a department of the town determined that they wanted to hire a paid fire chief, just like they had a paid police chief, and really start to build it up. And that's when I decided to apply for the job, because it looked like it would be a very interesting challenge.
So you basically were part of that whole process of making that conversion and getting it to where, you know, I would imagine that's a very big shift in culture and everything else that would go with that.
It really was a huge shift. You know, before we had to negotiate contracts annually with all three of these entities, and it really was a pain, to be honest with you. A lot of pain in the rear end. When it became a city fire department, then the city did the negotiation with the two townships, and it really changed the culture of things quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, you know, probably 90% of the people in Fishers were not there at that time, because it was just in the beginning, burgeoning growth. I mean, Ken Thompson, it was really late 70s. I think maybe early 80s is when he started doing Sunblessed down, 116th Street, Aliceville, all
Late
that
70s, I believe it was. Yeah.
Pardon me?
Late 70s.
Yeah, I think it was late 70s, because I remember them going in there, and Ken talking about the changes. Fishers was freaking out because they didn't have any, utilities, and so he ended up putting the water and sewer lines in, and he owned that entity for a long time before the city took that over. So I mean, it's hard for people today that have been Fishers for 10 years or less probably have no idea just how fast this has changed from a rural little village, little hamlet, to.
Yeah, and prior to the town taking over the fire department, we had to do that fire department had to do a lot of its own fundraising. So we did annual fundraising projects, and we were constantly begging for donations just to have enough money to keep fuel in the trucks. It was really something else. And one of the things we used to do, you'll remember this, I'm sure, we used to have a fish fry.
Oh, I loved it.
And we would close down, again, for you folks that have lived there less than 10 years or 10 years or less, you're not going to believe what I'm telling you, but we used to close down 116th Street completely, shut it down, and put this fish fry in the middle of the road. And it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. I'll tell you that. It was a lot of work.
Well, I even predate you on that fish fry, because when I grew up in Fishers, and back in the 60s and what have you, that was one of my highlights. That and the county fair were the two of the big things going on, because they'd shut everything down. The kids would run wild. All the businesses had bingo in them and whatever to do, and it was such a blast. And I try to tell my kids, I go, if you want to know what Fishers was like when I was growing up, have you ever seen the movie Doc Hollywood with Michael J. Fox? And they have that little festival in town, their little village there. That is exactly what Fishers was like. So
yeah, it really was. And by 1987, that fish fry had obviously gone away. There was no way they could close down 116th Street anymore. And the fundraising was just becoming a nightmare for the fire department, because, we needed a lot of equipment. We needed a lot more modern stuff, because they were building apartment buildings and so forth. And we just had to have a lot better equipment and a lot better training, and we had to pay for all that. And it was just getting to a point where the fire department itself and the town really agreed together that this was the best thing to do, was for that fire department to become part of the town. and that's what happened in 1987.
Well, I mean, it was a big change. I mean, and like I said, it's fun to talk to somebody that knows Fishers before Fishers was what it is today. But what now there's something else I want to talk to you about. You did something that my kids remembered, and they always had a blast. You know, when you guys would come into their schools, you had the MC Act. Was it? Tell me if I'm saying it right. MC Axe and the Fire Crew. Was that the way it was?
That
Or
was it. That was it. That was our musical group that we did. The problem was we would go into the schools as the fire department every year during fire prevention week, and the kids would be bored stiff. They didn't want to listen to some stodgy firefighter standing up there talking to them about stop, drop, and roll. So we decided to try something that would liven things up, and started this little musical group. And the first year we did it, it really was a joke. It was intended to be funny, like, oh, these firefighters are trying to form a band, and it was kind of a joke, but it really caught on, and the kids absolutely loved it. So we started building it up, and it really got out of control. We ended up doing a partnership with public television, and creating music videos for kids that were played rather consistently, between the morning PBS shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and that kind of thing. And that group, we did an album, we did a video. It really took off and kind of got a life of its own. But it was a lot of fun. We used to look forward to that every year, going into the schools and have a lot of fun with that.
well,
But
in
we
fact,
that group traveled all over central Indiana. We went to Michigan. We went to other states. It was really something else when it was in its heyday.
well, it caught. I mean, it was on TV. It was everywhere. I mean, I remember, and my kids were right in your, wheelhouse at the time, and they just loved it. When you come to school, they talk about it and stuff, and they always got a kick that I knew you, kind of stuff, But in
was
fact, what's funny, you're still on YouTube. I was able to find you pretty easily. So
yeah, it was pretty funny to go in stores and things like that and be recognized, not because I was the fire chief, but because I sang and was the lead singer for MCX and the Fire Crew.
Yes.
And the little kids would recognize me first, and then the parents would recognize me, and it was it was kind of creepy, but it was funny, because you couldn't go anywhere without somebody going, "Hey, I've seen you on PBS," So
yeah, well, that was fun. It was a fun thing. So I imagine it did. There's nobody's really done anything quite to duplicate it since. So Fisher's had its own little lore there. So
yeah. And actually, when I left Fishers and went to the next fire department that I worked for as a fire chief in New Hanover County, North Carolina, we started a similar program there as well. And it went for years. In fact, I think they just shut that down a few years ago. But they had a very similar program going down there, and they would go into all the schools and similar type of deal. So we kind of repeated that with another fire department. So it kind of became a model for us.
Well, don't break what works, right? So
yeah, don't break what works.
Well, we were talking before we went live, and you were talking about the fact that you went down there to do the same thing for that small town that was just in that same transition process. Is that correct? Or
well, Wilmington, North Carolina is a pretty good sized city, but the area outside the city limits within the county was made up of a number of 7 different fire departments that were volunteer. And again, the same thing, that Wilmington was exploding with growth. I think you said your daughter lived there for a while.
Yeah.
So she could probably tell you it just exploded, very similar to Fishers. It was deja vu when I moved there. It was, streets and roads and schools and everything getting built, just constantly new construction. It was traffic and the whole 9 yards. So It was very much similar to what I'd done in Fishers, but they wanted to take those 7 volunteer fire departments and make them into a career county fire department. And so they hired me in to help with that transition based on my experience that I had at Fishers. And I was there from 1996 to 2000.
Well, your MC accent wasn't like you just came out of nowhere. You didn't you have radio background before that? I mean, I think weren't you like the youngest? Like, if I recall, you were like one of the youngest in the country, like managing. Was it WXIR or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah. I was in radio for years. That's actually I started out when I was in high school working in a radio station, and I ended up working at a radio station in Indianapolis and a radio station in Anderson, Indiana, and kind of went back and forth. But for a while, I was the program director at that little radio station in Indianapolis, and I was pretty young. I was just out of high school
Yeah.
and had that management position. And I remember wondering, had all these people that were much older than me that worked for me, and it was weird. That was weird. But yeah, that background in radio kind of helped spur some of that interest in coming up with an entertaining way to teach fire safety. So I used a little bit of that background from broadcasting.
Well, you're still in the fire industry as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, I own a little software company that makes software for fire departments now.
Okay.
After I left New Hanover County, I went to Northeast Ohio, and I was a chief up there for 3 years, and then went into consulting, and I worked for a company called Emergency Services Consulting International, which is a large fire service consulting company, and I spent 10 years as a senior vice president at that consulting company, and then decided to launch this business, and I went off on my own, and here I am running a little software company.
Well, very good. Well, one of the things I was going to ask you, just because I'd love to pick your brain on, you were there right when the powder keg was lit at Fisher's predominantly. I mean, it was like it went from the little village that I grew up in, where had, like, I think when I was 3, the census said there were 300 people at Fisher's, and there were 11 Morgans, and not counting cousins. So it was a pretty
Yeah.
small town, and it had grown into the late 70s and the early 80s to where it was starting to make some noise that we knew it was getting ready to explode. What you were part of the leading process of putting the fire department together going into that growth. How did you guys like plan for, because I mean, it literally right after that is when it just the powder keg went off.
Yeah, it really, during those years that I was there from 87 to 96, it was just, pedal to the metal in terms of growth. I can kind of feel for you. When I first came to Fishers in 78, I think it was about 1,300 people. And, that just exploded. I think a few years later, it was up to 13,000 people, and continuing to grow beyond that. So you had to plan for that growth, but at the same time realizing that fire department had never experienced that kind of call volume and the types of businesses and the types of buildings that we were having to respond to. So we were having to get new equipment and different types of equipment and different types of training. So like you said, it really did change the culture, and there was a lot of planning that had to go into that.
Well, I just did a quick Google search on the population today. It's a little over 100,000. So,
Yeah. Yeah, you
and you
take
were,
anywhere, I don't care where it is, and you go from 13,000 people in, let's just say it was 1990 or 1995, 1990, and to 100,000 in 2023. That's a huge amount of growth in a very short period of time.
it really is. So, we were just talking. I was tickled that you got a chance to be here couple months ago, to see what it looks like, because it has changed just a bit. So,
Yeah, I was there for my niece's wedding and drove through downtown again. Of course, I've been there a few times since I left, a number of times, but because I've still got relatives in the area. My brother still lives in Greenfield, and my brother-in-law and sister-in-law live in Fishers on 121st Street. So so I've been there quite a few times, but the most recent time was there in December for a wedding, and I went down the old street that the very first house my wife and I bought after we got married. The very first house was on Maple Street, and I went down Maple Street, and finally, at long last, the house was gone.
Well, most of the houses I grew up in are gone, so
Yeah,
it's kind of, they, in fact, if down, in fact, I remember one time I was having a party. This was back many, many years ago, and I was on Morgan Drive because I was so tickled because I was in Morgan Meadows, which is my granddad had developed that. But I was down there, and you showed up with you. I think you had a ranchero, and you had your light flashing, and all my friends were running out the back door. So yes.
That sounds like something my brother would have put me up to.
I think we could have been.
Surprised he wasn't with me.
Yes, there you go. Well, he was probably with me, so but anyway.
Yes,
Yeah.
probably.
But yeah, but that whole area there, they bulldozed almost all those houses and put new stuff up in their apartments and more higher end stuff. The streets
Yeah.
are still there. You got Morgan Drive and Francis for my grandma and all that kind of stuff. So it's fun to watch. I mean, I go through this, and I am I'm not one of those that say we have to keep things the same. So but it is a remarkable growth. I think you said when you first came to Fish, there was 1,000 people.
Yeah, I think it was like 1,300 people,
Yeah.
something like that, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So, well, I really appreciate you spending some time with us, kind of giving some insight. Do you still keep in touch with is there anybody in the department that's still from your days, or?
Yeah, I've got friends that are still on the department. Now it's funny because one thing I didn't mention, but after I got hired, we quickly hired a number of other people. I hired a deputy chief, Brian Lott, who later became the chief after I left. Brian was the chief for a number of years, was also township trustee in Fall Creek Township. But then I also hired a number of career firefighters and officers for that department. And by the time I left, there was kind of a cluster of career personnel and still a whole bunch of volunteers. So it was a combination department, what they call a combination staffing department. But some of those guys now are retiring. And so I get to watch people that I hired retire from the fire department. And I get a kick out of that every time I see an announcement that one of them is retiring. I just chuckle and go, wow, that guy lasted that long.
So how many people did you have when you first started that were actual full-time firemen?
I think when I left in '96, there were maybe a couple dozen. I can't remember how many we had when I left. But we had just opened Station 2, which was at the time the Fall Creek Station, way out up Brook School Road and 116th Street. And so we'd hired some people for that. And we were in the middle of planning for the station that ultimately ended up at the airport, which is still there, I believe.
Yeah, it is. I think they just did some changing on it, but yes.
Yeah. We were doing planning for that particular station when I left. But again, some of those people are retiring. I'm getting a kick out of watching that. Good for them.
Yeah.
Good for them. Yeah, great.
Well, I was going to say too, is anybody that's watching this video now or maybe down the road, please come join us at the Fishers Historical Society. We have a meeting at the Delaware Township Center once a month. It is the 12th? Hang on a second here. It is the second Tuesday of every month. So it's at and it comes on at 7 o'clock. So anyway, we're there from about 7 to 8. And if you want to come and learn more about the history of Fishers, we love to That's obviously what we obviously have a bug about that because that's what we're there for. And then we're looking to hear your stories and what have you else. So if you're ever in Fishers and you happen to be around, come see us. So
Oh,
that would be
definitely. That would be a riot. I've still got somewhere in this house. I'm pretty sure I've still got my copy of the Mudsock manuscripts. I think it
oh
was
yeah, from Larry Reynolds.
from Larry Reynolds. Yeah, yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of really cool old stories in that book.
Oh, I love that book. In fact, I found pictures of my great grandfather in that book I had never seen before.
No kidding.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah. So it
That's
was very
amazing.
fun. Well, like I said, I want to thank you as our very first guest on our history chat, or whatever we're going to end up calling this. So is there anything else you want to say to the fine folks of Fishers while we got you here?
No, it's a great city. It was always a great town. It was a wonderful place to live. I'm glad I got to raise my kids, at least partly, raise my kids there. Got great fond memories, wonderful friends at the fire department. Yeah, it's a great place to live, was then and still is, as I understand.
Bill, thanks so much for spending the time with us. I'm real excited that you were our first guest on this, and it was great to hear about Fishers.
Glad to be here.
All right, man. Have a good one.
All right, take care.
Thank you.